Bloodborne has one of the best stories I have ever seen. It's widely regarded amongst fans as a masterpiece and one of the best in the Souls series, and after finishing the game myself, I'm inclined to agree. Welcome back to another story review, the series where we look at some old games, and I not only give you a retelling of the game's story, but also give my opinions along the way. We've already done a few of these in the past, and I plan to do many more in the future, so if this interests you in any way, consider watching some of my previous episodes or subscribe for future ones. But as for today, we'll just be focusing on Bloodborne. So without further ado, let's get started. As always, I want to put a massive spoiler warning now, as we'll be going through the entire game and DLC throughout this video. Although I do understand though that many may not even know what Bloodborne is, so allow me to give you a very basic spoiler-free rundown of the game's plot, then you can decide from there. Bloodborne takes place in a fictional world of Yharnam, and we play as someone only known as the Hunter. Yharnam is known across the world for its blood ministration, as the blood they use is said to cure all illnesses. We're an outsider who came to Yharnam to seek this blood in hopes of possibly healing us, but that's not all this blood does. The blood in Yharnam has a secret the Healing Church does not want getting out. Furthermore, that's not the only secret Yharnam has within its walls. Sadly, this is all I can say for now without ruining most of the story. If this sounds remotely interesting to you, then go buy the game. Sadly though, it is only on PlayStation, so I can understand if you can't get your hands on it. Now that the introduction is out of the way, let's actually dive into the game's narrative. So right away, Bloodborne forgoes the usual lengthy cutscene that gives a summary of the world's events. Originally, I was going to write a strongly worded paragraph on how much this annoyed me, but after looking at it differently, I realized how much of this story would genuinely be ruined with an introduction like the previous games. The reason being is that Bloodborne is hiding its actual story for most of the game, and if any of the history or events of the world were mentioned, then it would not only make the player more confused, it would also ruin the surprise. So instead, the first second of the game starts with someone walking up to us talking about Yharnam and something called pale blood. It's assumed that our character had asked a question to the blood minister and that the cutscene starts right after we ask it. So it's possible that our character was trying to seek this pale blood, but given that they're trying to get a blood transfusion, it's possible that the player is also afflicted with some illness and sought out Yharnam because of their extraordinary blood. However, before we're given the blood, we need to sign a contract. Because the blood of Yharnam is so sought after by the rest of the world, it's obviously in high demand, so as payment the church requires a contract to be signed. But this contract isn't so that we pay them for their services, but rather be of service to the people of Yharnam as thanks for being given their blood. In Yharnam, a strange phenomenon has occurred, as we can see that the town is overrun by beasts. By signing the contract, we become a hunter and are tasked with bringing an end to the hunt. So it can be surmised that this hunt we partake in is our end goal, except that's not entirely true. It's clear we the player didn't come to Yharnam to stop the hunt, we came here for the blood. Our actual objective is much different, however there is a slight problem. Right after receiving the blood, we wake up and the first thing we see is a note that reads, "Seek the pale blood and transcend the hunt." This note highlights an issue with Bloodborne's writing, which are the translations. The first half of this note is incorrect. From Software, the creators of the game are known to be Japanese, so translation errors are quite frequent in their games. This can sometimes be a few incorrect words or the whole description missing. At least within the English version, some of the text is wrong. This note doesn't actually say handwritten scrawl, as in Japanese it actually says scribbled in your own handwriting, implying that our character wrote this note. But in the English version, that's not explained, which is why there are constant questions on many forums as to who wrote the note, despite there being a clear answer. This isn't the only translation error that Bloodborne has, but it's definitely the most notable. After the note is read, we head downstairs to fight the very first enemy, and we die. This, however, teleports us to the Hunter's dream. The reason we're here is that earlier, before getting up from the table, we hear the blood minister say that we will simply be seeing a bad dream before a beastly figure appears in front of us as engulfed in flames. Right after, these tiny little white men, which we learn are called messengers, surround our body. These little guys worship and aid the hunters in the Hunter's dream, and it's because they're connected to the player that allows us passage into that Hunter's dream. The place's name is a bit misleading, as it's a real place, but it's not a real place. Like, it doesn't exist within Yharnam physically, but it's also not a dream because we can physically die in here. This may sound extremely confusing, but I do have a theory on this that I'll explain a bit later when we get to the Nightmare Realms. Getting back on track, we discover that we aren't alone in this dream, as there is a doll that becomes our level up lady, and then there's Gehrman, the first hunter. The Hunter's dream becomes a base of operations for the player, but was also a base of operations for many other hunters that came before us, as not only are there graves everywhere signifying that people used to be here, the doll also just straight up tells us this. While we're in here, we finally get to pick our weapons and finish our loadout. Bloodborne handles combat much differently than the other Souls games, and while it may not be intentional, I think this flows quite well with the game's story. Firstly, all the hunters carry a weapon and a gun at all times. However, there isn't much to choose from in this game. Just as a quick comparison, not including the guns, there are only 26 melee weapons the player can use, compared to Dark Souls 1, where 26 weapons just fills up the straight swords and great swords. There's still a dozen other categories of weapons that haven't even been mentioned. Furthermore, the game has also removed armor and changed it to attire. Out of all the clothing in the game, I think there's one armor set that actually says the word armor on the item as opposed to robe or garb. So Bloodborne has significantly decreased the quantity of both categories, but you know that saying quality over quantity, and I think Bloodborne ran with this idea. In terms of the way I see it, as a hunter, especially when it comes to hunting beasts such as these, mastery of your weapon is not only expected of you, but it's required if you want to stay alive. So by giving the player fewer weapons, it gives them fewer options, and possibly more time with one weapon. One of the first weapons available to the player is the flagship saw cleaver. I used this weapon the entire game. This is because Bloodborne's weapons are all about the moveset rather than the damage. The worst weapon based on damage is the Blade of Mercy at 60, with the highest being 105, which belongs to the Kirkhammer. Compared to other games where starting damage can be anywhere from 55 to 160 depending on the weapon, it makes this game's damage difference irrelevant. What I'm trying to convey is that the game is almost encouraging you to be a real hunter by dedicating a long time to one weapon. Now of course you're free to change to whatever weapon you want whenever you want, as it's quite generous with upgrade materials, but I've always felt that this lack of quantity was intentional so that the player feels like a proper hunter, one who has dedicated time to mastering the inner workings of the weapon. This is further reinforced by the game's trick system, which changes the weapon's form and not only adds more moves to the weapon, but also different combo strings, as you can switch forms mid-combination. As for the attire, on the surface this may not make sense, but given how the flow of combat works, I think it fits perfectly within this game. In Bloodborne, dodge rolls only exist when not locked on, as when in combat your character does a dash. On top of this, their health loss isn't permanent, as the rally mechanic allows you to regain health back by attacking the enemy. The rally and dash mechanic try to push the player towards a more aggressive style of play, especially when you take into account the visceral attacks and how some runes can give you your health back from them. The game is trying to push you to use your healing items as a last resort, and this quick pace of combat would be impossible if the player was covered in armor. So Bloodborne removed armor and added attire since it's a lot lighter and gives the player more freedom of movement. By far my favorite things to look into is how the gameplay ties into the story, and Bloodborne does a fantastic job at this by giving meaning to the weapons and armor we find in game. As while it may seem trivial, many games don't even bother really putting in that effort to justify these things. So when it does occur in cases like Bloodborne, it allows me to be more invested in the story as everything was taken into account. After selecting our equipment, we can head back and kill the beast that defeated us. Once it's defeated, we can walk outside the clinic and enter Central Yharnam, and I gotta say, Bloodborne is stunning. Not just in the actual design of Yharnam, but the small details put into the levels as well. Yharnam clearly takes inspiration from the Victorian era, but adds a more gothic twist to it, as evidenced by the rough and lethal architecture, like the overuse of spikes near ladders and the overall neutral color palette the town has. One thing that has irked me on occasion is most of the Souls games take place in a broken land that is way past its prime, but not a single game has ever actually convinced me that this is the case until I played Bloodborne. Some standout levels though, like Undead Burg and Farron Keep, do an excellent job at conveying this theme, but Bloodborne carries this throughout the entire game. There is so much death and decay within these areas that you can feel how miserable the people are here. But that's just on the surface, as there are those smaller details I talked about, where within a few minutes after leaving the clinic, you can find a large crowd of the townspeople huddled around a fire pit. The townspeople are also called the Yharnamites, so I'll be using that from now on. This may not seem significant until you realize that in the fire pit is a cross with a beast being crucified on it. This one tiny area shows the disdain people have for these beasts, and shows that the hunters aren't the only ones fighting back against the beast curse. But once again, this also makes sense, as hunters are trained to fight these creatures, which is why you normally find them alone, whereas the Yharnamites are just regular people, so they travel in packs, which is why we fight large numbers of them. These small details continue to get even smaller as certain characters like the old hunters from the DLC have belts around their right leg. If you notice while playing, our player heals by stabbing something into their right leg. The old hunter trouser reads, "A widespread belief of the period was that beast blood crept up the right leg, and this led to the double-wrapped belt." These design decisions and small details are just like the weapons and attire we previously talked about. Details that didn't need much backstory, as the player probably wouldn't have noticed or cared if it wasn't added, but by adding them it shows that not only are From Software genuinely good developers, but every detail was taken into consideration. Getting back on track, our objective is still to seek the pale blood and transcend the hunt. However, this is quite obscure and vague, so thankfully Bloodborne provides a much more approachable and straightforward objective from a note in the hunter's dream that reads, "To escape this dreadful hunter's dream, halt the source of the spreading scourge of beasts, lest the night carry on forever. Even if the previous objective makes zero sense, this at least gives us something to think about and also acts as a justification for our actions. Except there is a slight issue, as not only do the beasts attack us, but the Yharnamites do as well. This is bizarre, as I just talked about how the Yharnamites are taking part in the hunt alongside us, but this is cleared up by the story. It's discovered that the cause of the beast is from the blood itself. Currently, we don't know why it's the blood or what is in the blood that's causing this problem, we just know that this is the reason why. This is very typical of Souls games, where questions will be answered with a brief summary that gets more complex and fleshed out as we continue. For now though, what we uncover is that the blood of Yharnam is more intoxicating than alcohol, and this addiction to blood is what's causing people to seek out more, and since it already has some disastrous side effects, the more someone consumes, the worse it'll get. This may not be the same for all the residents, but if you pay attention to the Bloodborne trailer when the camera zooms in on the eye of the Yharnamite, you can see that their pupil is sort of broken or misshapen, and it also looks eerily similar to the eye of a blood-drunk hunter, the item we used to enter the DLC. And just like the item says, even hunters aren't safe from this inevitable fate. In fact, I think they're worse off than many, as they're constantly killing beasts and surrounded by the hunt. That's why characters like Eileen the Crow exist, as when you meet her, she tells us that while we're a hunter of beasts, she's a hunter of hunters. Throughout her questline, we assist her in killing certain hunters who may have been consumed with bloodlust. It's her duty as the hunter of hunters to grant them a merciful death. However, even she is not immune to this fate, as if we don't do her questline, instead of the Crow of Canehurst arriving at the cathedral, she'll be here and attack us instead, implying that she too succumbed to the bloodlust, and it was because of us assisting her in her hunts that we were able to prevent this fate from happening. However, just as the hunters within Bloodborne are unique, so too are the beasts. The first two bosses of Bloodborne are actually a really great visualization of the effects the blood has on people, as we can find the Cleric Beast, a beast we definitely haven't seen before, and Father Gascoigne, a hunter drunk from bloodlust. But it's also here where Bloodborne deviates from the other games in regards to its storytelling. Bloodborne focuses more on context clues for its lore rather than item descriptions. The descriptions do exist, but definitely play less of a role in Bloodborne. Compared to the other Souls games, where one boss will have a soul, weapons, and possibly armor tied to it, giving you 7 different pieces of information, in Bloodborne, most of the time you'll just get one, and even then you're lucky to get that. For example, the Cleric Beast drops one item called the Sword Hunter's Badge, where the last sentence reads, "As it was, clerics transformed into the most hideous beasts." From this item, we can conclude that the clerics who were a part of the Healing Church, the organization that distributes the blood, were affected by the blood even more than the Yharnamites or possibly the hunters due to them being near it all day. This caused them to transform into different forms of beasts, which are much different than the ones we find in Yharnam. Even without this item, you probably could have came up with this idea, as the boss's name is Cleric Beast, implying that it's a beast that used to be a cleric. This is the same for Father Gascoigne, who only drops a key to the door behind him. We don't get any lore from him on why he turned into a beast, but given our knowledge on the blood of Yharnam and the beast curse, we can come to the assumption that he was consumed by bloodlust. These are much more tame examples, but it becomes tougher when you talk about bosses like the one Reborn, which drop absolutely nothing regarding its backstory. But because the area it's located in and the area's history, we can use small bits of lore to piece together our own story about the boss. This will inevitably frustrate players, as the most basic form of lore, that being the boss souls and items, are no longer a viable way to understand the story. But personally, I don't mind the way Bloodborne altered its own way of storytelling. It's definitely more difficult than other Souls games, and especially when we get deeper into the game, but it was a nice change of pace and it forced me to think about my surroundings and actively pay attention. As I said, I didn't mind this, but I can see many people who will be annoyed or even turned off by this, as the game provides even less ways to access key items. After defeating Father Gascoigne, we're able to enter the Odin Chapel and subsequently the Cathedral Ward, and it's here where the game becomes a bit more open, and thus where I believe the tutorial officially ends. The Cathedral Ward will act as our temporary base of operations, but only in the sense that we're going to be coming back here quite often. From here, the player can explore many different areas like Hemwick, Old Yharnam, and the Forbidden Woods. However, before going to these areas, we need to clear out the Cathedral Ward itself to prevent some backtracking, because at the end of this level is Vicar Amelia. Similar to Father Gascoigne, she doesn't drop much except a pendant, which just tells us that vicars were heads of the Healing Church, and this pendant they carry is to remind them of their old adage, which is fear the old blood. But once again, you didn't need this info, as her story is just like the Cleric Beast, someone who transformed into a different beast thanks to the high amounts of blood that were around them. The reason we have to defeat her is so that we can touch the skull behind her, which shows a cutscene of two people talking to one another, that being Master Willem and Laurence. These two will play a massive role later. Afterwards, we can visit Old Yharnam, and this highlights another wonderful detail about Bloodborne, and that's not only do the characters and bosses have great stories, but the areas do as well, and it's these locations that assist us in providing backstories to those characters and bosses within the area. such as in Old Yarnum, where upon entering we're told to leave. Should we refuse, we get shot at by someone atop a tower. We discover that this person is a hunter named Dejura. This is the first instance we see of hunters defending the beast from other hunters, which is quite odd given their whole job is to kill them. But Old Yarnum has quite the tragic backstory. Old Yarnum and its residents were ravaged by a sickness known as ashen blood, and due to its poisonous effects, it caused more of the beast scourge to spread, and because it was spreading too fast, drastic measures needed to be taken, so Old Yarnum was locked away and burned to the ground. This relates to why Dejura is protecting them, because he feels guilty for what happened, and assuming you don't anger him like I did, you can talk to him peacefully, and when spoken to, he'll say this.
I no longer dream, but I was once a hunter too. There's nothing more horrific than a hunt. In case you fail to realize, the things you hunt, they're not beasts. They're people. One day you will see.
I really like the addition of Dejura as a character because it humanizes things in Yarnum, as it shows that there are hunters out there who genuinely care about what they're hunting and feel terrible about it. He realized that the beasts he was trying to kill are just regular people, and even though they're beasts, he can't use that as justification to kill them, especially when you take into account how the people of Old Yarnum were even turned into beasts in the first place. That's why Dejura doesn't blame the beast, but rather the church, as they were inflicted with a disease that was accelerated thanks to the church, and it was the church themselves that deemed the place unlivable, which is why it was sectioned off and burned. It's a horrific but wonderfully crafted story, and a lot of the locations in Bloodborne do have incredible backstories that really make you stop and think once you get all the details. For example, after going through a few other areas, we'll eventually make it to Byrgenwerth, and it's here where the story of Bloodborne reaches its climax. Byrgenwerth is a place of study here in Yarnum. As we make our way through the building, we can come across a man on a chair who we'll know to be Master Willem thanks to the flashback from earlier. Master Willem is the head of the Byrgenwerth scholars here in Yarnum, and they made a very disastrous discovery. We don't know what that discovery is, but we'll find out shortly, as while Willem can't speak to us, he does motion us towards the ledge, and by jumping into the water, we enter another plane of existence, with the only thing in here being Rom, the vacuous spider. Killing Rom is the start of the mystery. After her death, we see a lady who we will eventually discover to be the undead Pthumerian queen, who's also named Yarnum. After we speak with her, the moon glows a violent red color as it inches closer and closer to us, in fact so close that the clouds are actually traveling behind it. Thankfully though, we awake from the terrifying nightmare and are back on the mainland. At least you can go on believing that, as long as you don't look up. This creature is an amygdala, and it's not only a species of creatures that have existed in Yarnum, it's also been here the whole time we've been playing. You can visit this exact area before reaching Rom, and assuming you're careless enough to not look around, something invisible will grab you and give you a sneak peek of the real story of Yarnum. But this alien creature is just the tip of the iceberg, because Bloodborne was never actually about the hunt. It's about ascension and experimentation, and most importantly of all, it's about the Great Ones. This is where the story of Bloodborne permanently changes, and to help you get up to speed, let me explain what's exactly going on here. And don't worry if you get lost or confused along the way, I'll try to summarize the basic details at the end. Bloodborne's story begins years ago, when an ancient race of people called Pthumerians would discover the Great Ones and thus lead to their wisdom of the Eldritch Truth. The Eldritch Truth is basically a catch-all phrase for the Great Ones, as Pthumerians were able to discover that the Great Ones exist and that they inhabit a higher plane of existence much higher than our own. All of this pretty much encompasses the Eldritch Truth. Eventually, the Pthumerians would become the eternal guardians of the Great Ones, which is why they're present in the Chalice dungeons we enter from the Hunter's Dream, as those are the places they rested. After some time, all the Great Ones ascended to an even higher plane of existence, except Ebritus, who was the only one left behind. A bit farther in the future, the Pthumerians would establish a government system and elect a monarch who we know to be Queen Yarnum. She ended up having a child who was named Murgo, but Murgo was special as it was a half-human but half-Great One hybrid. Multiple lore descriptions tell us that the Great Ones will inevitably lose their children, so they seek out surrogates. At this point in time, Queen Yarnum would be the surrogate, but other characters will also be affected, like Ariana and Yosefka, as killing them drops an umbilical cord. Years go by and we reach the establishment of the Byrgenwerth College. This was led by Master Willem. The scholars of the college would eventually discover those areas we discussed before that we know as Chalice dungeons, and would uncover the history of the Pthumerians as well as the existence of what they called the Old Blood. This Old Blood is the blood of the Great Ones, and this was the turning point for both Byrgenwerth and Yarnum, as all their time was dedicated to figuring out how to not only communicate with these beings, but also ascend to their level of existence. This led to the scholars testing the Old Blood, but while overseeing the tests of the Old Blood, Master Willem feared its effects as they were still unknown, which is why he says the phrase, "fear the Old Blood." That cutscene we saw earlier is when Laurence would leave the college. Laurence believed that the blood was the key to humanity's ascension, as this blood had incredible healing properties. Master Willem, however, still believed that ascending was only possible by lining the brain with eyes, allowing the individual to gain insight into the Great Ones. This is further reinforced by the creatures we kill in Byrgenwerth who have multiple eyes. Because of their falling out, many of the scholars in the college were forced to choose who to side with. After the split occurred between Master Willem and Laurence, Master Willem would continue his research while Laurence and the members who followed created the Healing Church. Due to having a proper setup and a base of operations, the method of blood transfusion was quickly discovered, but as we know, this made things worse in Yharnam as it created the Beast Scourge. So Laurence worked with Gehrman to create the first Hunter's Workshop so they could stop the beasts. Clearly, that didn't work, and the other organizations within the Healing Church would start to take notice, these groups being the Choir and the School of Mensis. Just like the prior groups, the Choir and the School of Mensis also wanted to ascend to a higher plane of existence. But their creation was made shortly after the downfall of the Healing Church, as not only was it proven that the blood was not working as they wanted it to, Laurence would also pass away, leaving the spot for leader up for grabs. So with the church in ruins and its leader dead, the rest of its members started taking matters into their own hands. The choir had the advantage of being able to visit Ibridis, the left-behind Great One, so they tried using her as well as other experiments involving children in their newly built orphanage. They would use these kids and turn them into celestial emissaries, with the intention of either being Great Ones themselves or using these emissaries as a way to communicate with the Great Ones so that they could learn more on them. The choir clothing set says, together with the left-behind Great One, they look to the skies in search of astral signs, as that may lead them to the discovery of their true greatness. They were also able to use what we would call magic, as the Augur of Ibridis was quite common amongst their ranks. As for the School of Mensis, they were led by a Mikolash, who also happens to use the same Augur of Ibridis magic, which may imply that the School of Mensis were originally members of the choir, or at the very least, Mikolash at least used to be. They're responsible for creating a ritual called the Mensis Ritual, which is an extremely confusing piece of lore that is never actually really explained. Some have said that it has to do with the Snatchers kidnapping people and using those people in their rituals, but there's also information that points to Mikolash using a child, possibly Murgo, to lure the Red Moon to them. Mensis may be a reference to the word month when talking about the moon and its monthly phases, so it seems like the moon was a part of their goal, but to what end though is unclear. Regardless, they performed the Mensis ritual and were able to create the Nightmare of Mensis, a nightmare realm I will get to later. Within this realm though are Queen Yharnam and her son Murgo, which is quite peculiar. Basically though, all of these groups separated due to their differing ideals and would even sabotage each other at times, as we can summon a Mensis student to fight Ibridis, who of course we know is to be affiliated with the choir, and to even get into the choir's orphanage we need to find a key to the Upper Cathedral Ward, which is located on a corpse in a cage which is in Yahar Ghul, run by the School of Mensis. While this division in the church was occurring, one rogue scholar would reach out to Castle Cainhurst, a place that had already existed for quite some time, and would then travel there to share their blood discoveries with them. The Healing Church would catch wind of this betrayal and spin a story that basically caused a holy crusade, as they claimed that Castle Cainhurst were creating vile beasts and needed to be stopped. This led to the creation of a group of hunters called the Executioners who assaulted the castle. The only problem is that the queen of the castle, Annalise, is immortal. To my knowledge, this is never explained but has been the basis of many theories. This immortality caused a problem because they couldn't kill the source of the Vile Bloods, which is why Ligarius, leader of the Executioners, can be seen in front of the throne room, as he locked her away permanently and guards the room so that no one may enter to free her. This also leads into Alfred's questline, who is also an Executioner and is way more than delighted to see the queen.
There, you filthy monstrosity. What good's your immortality now? Try stirring up trouble in this sorry state. All mangled and twisted, with every inside on the outside for all the world to see.
So quickly, let me summarize what I just said. So basically, Byrgenwerth found the tombs we know as Chalice Dungeons, which led to the discovery of the Great Ones and the Old Blood. The goal from then was how to ascend to a higher plane of existence. The methods of ascension are what created the different groups. Byrgenwerth, won by Master Willem, believed lining one's brain with eyes would give the person insight. This is once again reinforced by the multi-eyed creatures at Byrgenwerth. Laurence, founder of the Healing Church, believed the Old Blood was the key to ascension. Within this church were two groups of hunters. The official hunters, led by Gehrman, who were created to stop the beast curse from spreading, and then the Executioners, who who were created to put down the people of Castle Cainhurst as they believed they were evil. The last two groups were the former members of the church. The choir wanted to use Ebritus and their creation of the celestial emissaries as a mean of ascension, although once again it is still unclear whether the members of the choir wanted to become celestial emissaries or were just using them as a communication device to communicate with the Great Ones. And then finally was the School of Mensis, who kidnapped people and used them in obscene rituals and were somehow able to create the nightmare realm of Mensis that contains Queen Yharnam and her hybrid son Murgo. This is just a small part of Bloodborne's story. Not only is there so much we haven't discovered yet, but there are some details I left out of the previous topics for the sake of brevity and organization. There is genuinely so much to talk about, and if this didn't get you excited about the game's story, then I don't know what will, because this fundamentally changes how we see this game. I do want to clarify, you don't learn all this info I just explained after killing Rom. The only reason I waited until her death to explain the full story is because the proper context was needed, as now we can reanalyze our current knowledge and connect it to this new discovery. Like Rom herself, who seems to be just a spider until you realize that Rom was originally a scholar at Byrgenwerth who evolved into a Great One courtesy of Kos. Or even how many of the hunters and notable figures in the game wear blindfolds. This could be based on a theory within the game's world that the Scourge Beast plague causes people to lose their eyesight, but could also be a way for the person to prevent going mad from seeing the Great Ones, which also connects into the insight mechanic. These ideas could be completely wrong, but that's the point of creating a theory, and being able to connect new lore with previous lore so seamlessly is fantastic, and a testament to how detailed the world building of Bloodborne really is. But like I said before, we're not even done with the game's story, as there is so much more to uncover. But now we're starting to enter questionable territory. If there was ever one massive fault in Bloodborne's story, it's the lack of elaboration or just even a simple explanation related to some of the events and locations in the game. We briefly mentioned this before with some of the bosses like the One Reborn, who don't have a concrete backstory, but thanks to the history of Yahar Ghul, we're able to come up with a compelling theory based on this information. This, however, is not the same when discussing the Nightmare Realms. Bloodborne has this fascination with dreams and nightmares, as across the game we'll end up visiting 4 locations, called the Hunter's Dream, Hunter's Nightmare, Nightmare Frontier, and the Nightmare of Mensis. Just about all of them, minus the Hunter's Nightmare to an extent, are extremely confusing and very difficult to wrap your brain around. Once again, we're going to have to rely on context clues in the environment to help us come up with a theory, but there's even less to go off of within these realms, as they're completely separate from reality. Each of these places has a host, and its location is unknown, but it's assumed to be in a different plane of existence, but the location of this new plane is possibly closer than we think, as we can see the Cathedral Ward underneath the fishing hamlet in the Hunter's Nightmare, as well as being able to see the Nightmare of Mensis from the Nightmare Frontier. It's extremely confusing, as it seems that these places could operate like Yahar Ghul and are just simply an unseen village, or do exist but are unable to be preserved by normal humans, or maybe it's something else entirely. One thing that is for certain is that there is a host that created this specific realm for a specific reason. However, for some of them, we still don't know why. This is great as it gets the community talking, but theory crafting is only useful when there's a set amount of facts from which to build off of, but when it comes to these realms, there's very little to even start with. Many have pointed out how these realms are very similar to H.P. Lovecraft's Dreamlands, which, in case you weren't aware, H.P. Lovecraft was a massive inspiration for this game. According to some of my research in this topic, the Dreamlands are alternate dimensions, only accessible to humans through dreams. There's also a mention of the waking world, which is just the present realm the characters are in. So relating this to Bloodborne, current-day Yharnam would be our waking world, and all these other realms we visit are just the Dreamlands. But once again, the question still remains, how did these realms even come to be? Well, to start, we have to talk about the Nightmare of Mensis. To access this realm, we have to touch Mikulesh, who is clearly dead amongst the other members of the group. This nightmare seemed to take in things from the real world and put them in the nightmare, not completely removing them from Yharnam, but more like duplicating them, as the lecture building seemed to belong in Yharnam originally. After exiting the lecture building, we can officially make it to the nightmare, and it's clear this group does not want to be disturbed, as protecting the gates is this beam of light which comes from the brain of Mensis. The Nightmare of Mensis is interesting because it tries to convey to the player how time works, although admittedly it does that quite poorly. Another example of this is the Chalice dungeons. These dungeons are extremely unique, as you can fight bosses like Rom inside of them. This is very confusing already, but to add even more confusion to the mix, in the boss fight arena for Ebritus, called the Altar of Despair, it looks like Ebritus is bent over crying when looking in the direction of what seems to be Rom's corpse. So we have a dead Rom in the Altar of Despair, and 2 live Roms, one in the Chalice dungeon and one underneath the Great Lake at Byrgenwerth. The only explanation that I've come to is that it's related to time and the ability to be in multiple places at one time. While I have no way to explain the Chalice dungeons other than these places being a time in history that has been frozen, as for the other 2 parts of Rom, the one in the Altar of Despair seems to be the real Rom, and the one of the lake is also the real Rom, but not physically, just like how Micolash is dead in Yahar Ghul but very much alive in the Nightmare. It seems that these realms work very differently when it comes to time, as well as the physical body. It's also even more confusing when you consider that there are different hosts per realm, and the ways of entry are different per realm. Micolash more than likely can't enter the Hunter's Dream as he's not a hunter. We can't enter the Hunter's Nightmare without the Eye of the Blood-Drunk Hunter item, as we'll see when we discuss the DLC. The Hunter's Nightmare is for hunters who become drunk with bloodlust, so if you don't fit the criteria, you can't enter, which is why we need the item to gain entry to it. So how does Rom fit with all of this? Well, many within the community believe that all these planes of existences are on layers. If we use Yharnam as layer 1, then this place where Rom exists is layer 0. We eventually discover that we can see the cathedral from the Hunter's Nightmare, making that above it at layer 2. There's even a possible theory that the Amygdala in the Hunter's Nightmare fell from the Nightmare Frontier, since it's the boss of that area, making that place layer 3. Continuing further, many may speculate that the Nightmare Frontier is connected to the Nightmare of Mensis due to its close proximity, and the fact that the lecture building connects the two places, making the Nightmare of Mensis just either the top layer of layer 3 or maybe even its own at number 4. As for the Hunter's Dream, I believe it to be the highest layer within the realms that we know of, as the ending of the game kinda backs this up a bit. I really do like this theory a lot, although it's simply just a theory and it's impossible to know if this is truly correct. But it's clear that the things in these realms are not on the same system as Yharnam. Circling back to the Nightmare of Mensis, we know that Micolash is the host of the Nightmare, evident by his name, so killing him would stop the Nightmare, except that doesn't happen. To once again relate this to the Hunter's Nightmare, the only way to stop that nightmare is to kill Kos, because that is the host. The Orphan of Kos is not the host, as the nightmare doesn't end until you kill the Black Spirit lingering above Kos itself. But with the Nightmare of Mensis, it doesn't stop when you kill Micolash, as there is still another boss left, that being Murgo's Wet Nurse. The Wet Nurse is protecting Murgo, and it's only by killing Murgo that things actually end. Technically, you can revisit these realms even though the host is dead, so I just chalked that up to game design, as technically within lore they should be gone. So it seems that these realms operate differently depending on its inhabitants. Both of the realms officially end when the Great One in their respective realms is killed. So it's possible that the Great Ones hold more power in these realms despite not being the host in the case of Murgo. Although to be fair, the Nightmare of Mensis was made so that Micolash and the students of Mensis could communicate with Murgo, so maybe there's a loophole there. This is what I meant earlier when I talked about Bloodborne's biggest issue, because these past couple of minutes have just been complete speculation. This whole theory has no amount of truth to it, since it's simply just a theory. There is nothing wrong with leaving things up to interpretation and allowing the community to answer the mystery on their own, but I feel like there was something really lacking here when it came to these realms. It is probably one of my favorite pieces of lore to look into though, as there is so many diverse ideas, but there's also an issue because due to this lack of explanation, the community can't really agree on anything concrete as a base. Thus you have many outlandish ideas like people thinking the realms are different planets, or Yharnam is actually a realm in itself and the real Yharnam is something we don't get to see. Or who knows, maybe my theory is completely outlandish and those are more centered in facts. It's all over the place. Despite the obvious issue, the idea of these realms and how they are planes that exist that you aren't able to see by normal means is such a cool concept and further solidifies my previous statement. That Bloodborne's world building is insanely detailed, and even something like the Nightmare realms are able to be discussed thoroughly because the idea of what these places are and what they actually mean intrigues enough people to want to uncover the real truth. These realms could have simply been boring ideas and places that the players could deem unworthy to even bother mentioning, but it's due to the writing of the rest of the game that makes the very idea of trying to uncover the full story, even including the Nightmare realms, almost mesmerizing. At this point in the game, the only boss that stands in our way is Murgo's Wet Nurse, but killing the nurse leads to the game's ending, so before we get into that ending, we have to discuss the DLC. Bloodborne only came with one DLC, called The Old Hunters. This DLC takes place in the Hunter's Nightmare, which, as we discussed, is a nightmare realm created by a specific host for a specific reason. The purpose of this place is to give the hunters who succumb to bloodlust a place to go, which sounds rather wholesome until you discover why. The Hunter's Nightmare was created pretty early in Bloodborne's timeline. In the order of events we previously discussed, we have that era where the college was founded and then the old blood was found along with the Pthumerian tombs. And then afterwards the college would then split up because of all the different ideologies leading to the creation of things like the Healing Church, the Choir, and the School of Mensis. Well, the Hunter's Nightmare was created in between these two events. So it was before the creation of the Healing Church, meaning the Beast Curse had still yet to take form as Laurence was still testing the blood's effects. So this realm is years old at this point, possibly the oldest realm we could visit in-game. But this realm was created as a curse against the college and the hunters for what they did. During the early stages of experimentation and research at the college, Master Willem would receive a word of a washed-up Great One at a nearby fishing village. This Great One was known as Kos, the same one Micolash refers to during his boss fight.
As you once did for the vacuous realm. Grant us eyes. Grant us eyes.
It seems that Rom ascended to the spider form thanks to Cos, but given the word vacuous is just another way to say lack of intelligence, it's probably out of punishment for what occurred at the village. Master Willem, upon hearing this news, immediately sent scholars and hunters to investigate, and the reports were true. A great one did exist within the village. But even though they were turned into fish, they revered Cos and saw her as a god. In an attempt to investigate this being's power further, the hunters and scholars brutally destroyed Cos's body, and even did the same to some of the villagers. It's reported that they carved large gaping holes in the skulls of the villagers, and also violated Cos's corpse by possibly dissecting her skin and organs. But Cos is a great one, and even though a great one's body may die, its mind can continue to live on. And because she was still alive in a roundabout way, she was able to put a curse on all the scholars and hunters. All hunters, and on occasion random people as well, will be cast into the nightmare for eternity, engaging in endless hunting forever. This is the fate for all hunters, as after enough time the bloodlust will consume them, so it's inevitable that they end up here. We can enter the hunter's nightmare and put a stop to it by eliminating Cos. However, her child will appear upon arriving at the beach and fight us. It's only after defeating the orphan of Cos that we can slay the black spirit residing in Cos, which destroys the nightmare. But we have quite a few ways to go before getting there, as we have 4 bosses to get through first. One thing you'll notice about the old Hunters DLC is that the setting is identical to the Cathedral Ward, minus the massive chunks of debris everywhere. The reason why the Cathedral Ward is here is that I believe the Hunter's Nightmare is pulling in all the locations of tragedy. The fishing village is here, which is where the massacre took place, and the Cathedral Ward was the base of operations for the church, who unleashed the beast curse upon Yharnam, so it got pulled in here too. Some have theorized that the debris everywhere is the lack of knowledge the brain has when dreaming. If you think of a memory from yesterday, it's a lot more vivid than one from a few years ago. Over time, you'll forget small parts of that memory until it becomes impossible to remember. Someone made a really great analogy, and it's that this area is like the Cathedral Ward, except the person assigned to making the buildings didn't have the blueprints. It's impossible to remember every single detail in the Cathedral Ward, which is why parts of it seem to be missing. I really like how this environment ties into the real-world examples of how dreams and memories work within our brains. The first boss we find in the nightmare is this fiery cleric beast, who we can't fight just yet, so by passing him and going the other way, we can make it to Ludwig the Accursed. Just based on his appearance, it's clear that Ludwig has been here for quite some time. Ludwig was actually the first hunter of the Healing Church workshop. This is different compared to Gehrman, who was the actual first ever hunter. Once Laurence split from the college, they needed to enlist the help of the hunters, which led to the creation of the Hunters Workshop, which was of course run by Gehrman. However, the Yharnamites grew wary of the church and the workshop and believed that the church had something to do with the beasts. So Laurence shut down the workshop due to Gehrman and the other hunters' failure to quell the threat. Laurence then created the new Healing Church workshop and enlisted different hunters to help him. This failure also ties into Gehrman quite a bit when discussing the ending, but we'll get to that later. Ludwig was one of the early hunters of the Healing Church workshop, and because he was one of those early hunters, over time he succumbed to the blood, and due to the curse being created by Cos, was forced to live here for eternity. This is the same reason this fiery cleric beast is here, as this is Laurence. The same Laurence who created the Healing Church and the one who believed blood administration was the key to ascension is now eternally stuck in the Hunter's Nightmare. I really like the idea of making him a cleric beast, as he was obviously a high-ranking member in the church, just like the vicars and clerics, so it makes sense why their appearances would be similar. To even activate this fight, we need to find Laurence's skull in the Nightmare, which is way closer than you think, as we can use this lift, and by letting it go up, we can find it underneath the original lift. His skull reads, a symbol of Laurence's past and what he failed to protect. He's destined to seek his skull, but even if he found it, it would never restore his memories. So Laurence, the leader of the church, has now become nothing but a mindless beast, the very thing he unleashed upon the people of Yharnam, which I find to be quite an ironic fate. The next area we visit is the Research Hall, and this location was where many patients of Yharnam were being experimented on, with the same purpose of ascending. This is backed up by the palish skin similar to those who are considered kin, and at the top of this building is a garden with the living failures. These flowers in the garden were similar to the flowers in the Celestial Emissary arena, so it's possible that these patients were being used to create Celestial Emissaries, but the majority of them failed. And even the ones that did succeed the first step couldn't become emissaries, which is why they're called the living failures. But what's odd though is that throughout this area we hear people call out to a Lady Maria, who conveniently is our last boss. Lady Maria was one of the hunters present for the massacre at the fishing village. She regretted her actions deeply and thus decided to dedicate her time to watching over the patients and taking care of them. We know this as her Rikuyo, the weapon she commonly uses, can be found in-game at the bottom of a well, implying that throwing away this blade was not only her trying to forget this horrific event, but also her giving up her hunter status, which led to her being the permanent caretaker of the research hall. It's unclear how long she did this for, but she would eventually kill herself over this guilt, evident by the bloodstain on her clothes, implying that she slit her throat. Once again, due to the curse, she would then be sent to the Hunter's Nightmare for eternity. We also discovered that Lady Maria is related to Queen Annalise, the same one at Castle Cainhurst. I don't think there's any more development into this discovery, but I still think it is nice to know. Lady Maria is the one hiding the secret of the hunter's nightmare, and by killing her, we can walk through the fishing village and uncover the real truth. This would then lead us to Kos, and if you manage to kill her, then you can end the hunter's nightmare, permanently allowing everyone inside to finally achieve peace. The DLC for Bloodborne was just like its weapons. There was a clear attention to its quality rather than its quantity. The Old Hunters is not a long DLC, and took no longer than 4 hours to complete, but each of those 4 hours was not only filled with engaging gameplay, but also important pieces of lore that fill in some holes in the game's narrative. It's a fantastic DLC, and a necessity if you plan on playing this game. Returning to Yharnam, we can now go back to the Nightmare of Mensis to defeat Murgo. Murgo might have one of the most important roles in this game's story. The School of Mensis obtained an umbilical cord from a Great One, and used this to communicate with Murgo, but things went wrong and resulted in the stillbirth of their brains, which is why they're all dead. It's unclear why Mikulesh is the only one alive, but maybe it's because he was the one who used the cord, and thus is alive in the Nightmare realm, but dead in the real world, but once again we're entering that questionable territory. The reason we know this is because an umbilical cord drops after killing Murgo. These umbilical cords are key to the game's secret ending. After killing Murgo's wet nurse, the game pauses for a moment, and all we hear is a baby crying. After the crying is done, we finally get the Nightmare Slain title to appear. This implies that it wasn't the wet nurse who was the objective, but rather Murgo himself. Also, something interesting is that Queen Yharnam is outside the boss arena, and upon killing Murgo, she bows and disappears. This may tie into what we discussed with Rom, on how she is dead but alive in the lake. It's possible that she thanks us for finally ending Murgo and subsequently her misery, as they were stuck in these realms despite assumedly being dead already. Just like the Old Hunters, it's possible that we were finally able to give the mother and child the peace they needed to move on. Regardless, with Murgo dead, we return to the Hunter's Dream, and it's on fire. Talking with the doll, she motions us towards the great tree where Gehrman is located. Here is where we can get into the endings of Bloodborne, and there is 3 of them to discuss. Starting with the first one, this sees us accepting Gehrman's proposal. When we talk to Gehrman, he claims to offer us a way out of the Hunter's Dream. He's going to kill us, which will allow us to be free of the hunt and the dream altogether. Should we accept, he decapitates us, and we awaken a more peaceful version of Yharnam. Afterward, we can see the doll praying at our grave and hoping that we find worth in the waking world. Earlier, we talked about how Yharnam was the waking world, and how these nightmare realms were the dreamlands, at least according to H.P. Lovecraft. Well, this changes things, as this implies that the Yharnam we explore is just another realm, and the real Yharnam is the one at the end of the game, as the doll calls it the waking world. There's always been one thing that's bothered me about this game, and it's the dream itself. This is the one base of operations across the Souls game where nobody appears in the base. We only have the doll and Gehrman. No one else comes into this dream, but we can tell from the graves that others have come before us. But it seems that not every hunter has been to the dream. The only hunters that have been confirmed to be in the dream are Dejura and Eileen due to some of their dialogue. It's possible that the hunter's dream is used by one hunter at a time in order to stop the hunt. Given how many graves there are and that we see the doll pray near ours after the first ending, we can assume that these other hunters were possibly a part of the dream but were killed by Gehrman and given his mercy. In the case of Eileen and Dejura, maybe they're already dead. Remember how we talked about Rom being dead and alive at the same time? Maybe by accepting Gehrman's mercy, we become like Eileen and Dejura. We're still hunters that are still partaking in the hunt, but with little to no memory of the hunter's dream and are able to finally be free of its never-ending curse. Remember, the only reason we're here in the dream is the messengers, and from playing the game, we can assume that no one really knows what these are. I believe it's tied to the Great One we'll see in just a bit. So maybe this Yharnam really is the same Yharnam as before, but we're just unaware of the real story. Ignorance is bliss after all. The second ending is activated upon refusing his offer. Gehrman doesn't take no for an answer and battles us. If we defeat Gehrman, we finally get to see the real boss of Bloodborne, the real mystery of Bloodborne. This is the pale blood we've been seeking, and it's called the Moon Presence. If you've been connecting some of the dots earlier, I said that each realm has a host, like Murgo and Kos. Well, this is the host of the Hunter's Dream. This moon presence is related to the umbilical cords. It's known that these umbilical cords are sort of communication devices used by humans to talk to the Great Ones. It's unclear how this happened or even if this happened, but it's assumed that the umbilical cord came from Kos and was split into 3 pieces. Willem took the first piece, Laurence and the church got the second, and Mikulesh and the school got the third. Well, during the events of the Healing Church, Laurence worked with Gehrman to contain the threat of the beast. For multiple different armor sets and items, we can piece together that Gehrman had a deep love for Maria, but it seemed like Maria just respected him as a teacher and a friend. Gehrman never really managed to confess his love to her, and even if he somehow managed later to muster up the courage to do so, it wouldn't have mattered anyway because Maria took her own life. In a desperate attempt to keep her alive, Gehrman created the doll. That's why we see a doll in the original Hunter's workshop in Yharnam. Within the workshop is a small hairpiece that has a line in the description that reads, "Its color would stand most brilliantly against a head of grayish hair." Gray is the same color as Maria's hair, which is also the same color as the doll's hair. And when giving this to the doll, she cries.
What? What is this? I can't remember. Not a thing, only I feel a yearning, something I never felt before. What's happening to me? Tell me, Hunter, could this be joy?
To add even more to this discovery, when we kill Maria and return to the Hunter's dream and talk to the doll, she says that she feels liberated, as if the great shackles have been lifted off her, implying that she was made to be a replacement for Maria. Around this time, the church was failing, the Hunters were failing, and Gearman had no motivation to keep going, having just lost the one he loved. So Laurence pitched an idea, and Gearman would agree. They would use their third of the umbilical cord and ask a Great One for help. This cord, which is the one we find in the Hunter's workshop, reads, "The third umbilical cord precipitated the encounter with the Pale Moon, which beckoned the Hunters and conceived the Hunter's dream. The Pale Moon, also known as the Moon Presence, is the host of the Hunter's dream." It's unclear what the rules of the contract were, but it's assumed that Laurence and Gearman probably wanted a way to defeat the Scourge Beast, but contracts go both ways. The Moon Presence would keep Gearman in the Hunter's dream with the intention of training the Hunters and continuing the hunt. It's been debated since the release of the game what the actual motivation of the Moon Presence is. This has been the biggest discussion amongst the community, and it's never gotten anywhere. Going back to H.P. Lovecraft, it's very clear that the Great Ones are the same ones from his stories. The issue here is that the Great Ones were created to be incomprehensible in every way, meaning not only can we not even begin to understand what it even looks like, but not even what it wants. Despite some of the beings having the same title, the Great Ones each have different motivations and reasons for doing what it does, meaning its actions aren't like those of the College, where they wanted all of humanity to ascend. The Great Ones seem to act purely out of self-interest. But as we know from the umbilical cords, all Great Ones lose their children and yearn for a surrogate. Maybe the Moon Presence just wants a child. This relates to Ending 2, where we refuse Gearman's offer and then meet the Moon Presence, but it takes us in and replaces Gearman with us. We are now the new helper of Hunters within the dream. Maybe it wants a child, but in a different way. Not an infant like Murgo, but a grown one to watch over, which would be us. Maybe it wants to keep the Beast Scourge going, so that more Hunters will arrive at the Hunter's dream, thus giving the place purpose to exist, and allowing the Moon Presence to watch over the fight and watch over us. Remember, the Moon Presence only arrives once we defeat Gearman, so it's detected that something has happened, which is why it meets with us. It then realizes our power and seizes the opportunity to have a new helper in the dream. Many of the NPCs say that the night of the hunt is unending and that it's going on longer than usual. Maybe this is to be seen as quite literal, that the hunt will last forever as long as the Moon Presence exists. While there has been a lot of speculation on this, one thing we can confirm though is that this dream is not actually a dream, as Gearman has some unique dialogue that you may hear, and it's quite disturbing.
Oh, Laurence, Master Willem, somebody help me. Unshackle me, please. Anybody. I've had enough of this dream. The night blocks all sight. Oh, somebody, please.
From my interpretation of this either means that Gearman realized he'll be stuck here forever since Laurence and Willem are not in any state to come free him from the dream, or that he was brought here against his will. Either way, we need to stop the Moon Presence, and thankfully there is a way. Should the player consume the 3 umbilical cords, that being the one from Murgo, the one from the Old Hunter's Workshop, and then the last one from either Ariana or Yosefka, they can trigger the secret ending. Instead of being enthralled by its presence and becoming the new Gearman, we resist its power. The Moon Presence will then see us as a threat and attempt to get rid of us. If we win, we become an infant Great One, and do exactly what everyone has been trying to do for years. We finally did it. We discovered the true path to ascension, and with this profound knowledge in mind, we can now launch humanity into its next childhood. As I said, the motivation for the Moon Presence is unknown, and will likely never be known, so it's up to our interpretation. But after this though, we officially come to the end of the story of Bloodborne, and what a ride this has been. Bloodborne might have one of the best stories I've ever had the pleasure of uncovering. Despite some of the writing shortcomings, mainly the lacking of the explanation towards the Moon Presence and the Nightmare Realms, I still consider this one of the best narratives of all time. I believe that not everything needs to be mentioned in a story for it to be considered good or complete. Holes can be left with the intention of having the player fill them, and this is one of my favorite parts of a story. Being able to take a story from any medium, whether it's books or games, and being able to add my own ending or my own thoughts to its canon story. It allows me to take everything I've come to know about this game's world, its setting, its characters, and its main plot, and be able to make the story my own in a way that makes sense to me. Bloodborne is not only one of the best games of all time, it might also have one of the best stories of all time, and while it does take lots of effort to actually understand the story, I think that fits really really well with the Souls theme, a genre of games that have been known to be difficult in more than just gameplay. But of course, by making it to this part of the video, you've more than likely already had a lot of the story spoiled for you. Even so though, I do encourage you to pick up the game if you can. You will not regret it. But just as the story of Bloodborne has come to an end, so too has this video. Thank you all for watching today, and I really hope you enjoyed. This took lots of effort to make, but I think after some hours of research and brainstorming, I was able to piece it all together. It's quite easy to get tunnel vision when making a video like this, as you try to focus on the bigger picture but end up forgetting a small key detail along the way. So for whatever reason something I said was incorrect, do let me know in the comments down below. With that, like the video if you enjoy and subscribe if you're new, and thank you to my returning viewers for coming back to another video. As always, take care everyone, and goodbye.